There are probably no bigger disasters than me trying to run a Zoom room, but nonetheless, we are here, ironically, to discuss disaster mitigation with our panel of experts as below. I'm Liz Greig, Dr. Greig from the medical school. So it's a refreshing change to be talking about disasters that aren't COVID, but nonetheless need some serious attention. So I'm just going to introduce everybody, and then we will run through the videos, as I'm sure you saw in your last session. What I would like everybody to do who is a participant, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A as they come to your mind. And we will be compiling those questions as the videos run. And then at the end, when we have our Q&A session, we'll be pulling from those questions that you've posted in the Q&A. So don't be shy, just pop them in the text boxes. My bulldog is participating. Pop them in the text boxes, and we will take a look at them all at the end after all of the video sessions have run. So let me just introduce everybody very quickly. We have Dr. Carlos Genatios. He's the chairperson of engineering technology at Miami-Dade College. We have Dr. Renato Molina. He's an assistant professor at the University of Miami. And Renato, remind me which school you're in. You're in two schools, the business school and the Erasmus. That's our Marine.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. And there is Dr. McMillan, David McMillan, who's a postdoc fellow at the Miller School of Medicine, who works at the Miami Project to cure paralysis. And then we have Chris Narducci, who's a social science analyst at HUD. All right, so we'll hit the videos and we will be back for discussion at the end.
Hello, my name is Carlos Genatios. I'm the chairperson of engineering at Miami-Dade College, and I will be sharing with you the results of a work that we have been developing lately, and we have called it Local Disaster Risk Assessment and Community Engagement to Improve Resilience. This is a program that we have been developing together with experts from Miami-Dade College, Florida International University, iTech Magnet High School, and some industry partners and consultants that have worked with us in this program. The main three objectives of this project are to develop an educational pathway, to develop technology applications for disaster risk reduction, and to contribute to the Resilience 305 strategy for resilience building in Miami-Dade County. This is a strategy that is led by the Office of Resilience of Miami-Dade County. In relation to the academic pathway, we have created a college credit certificate. This is a 21 credit college credit certificate in which the students learn GIS, but they also develop on some projects related to the natural hazards and risk evaluation. This program has been articulated with a dual enrollment for high school students. In particular, we work with the iTech High School, which is located in Little Haiti in Miami. And the students can continue their studies to complete an Associate in Science and Information Technology and also a Bachelor in Science and Information Technology. And we are actually developing the articulation with Florida International University for the students to be able to complete their studies following in the graduate certificate in GIS at FIU. This is an academic pathway mainly oriented to underrepresented minorities. Miami-Dade College serves a community composed of minorities, Hispanics, Blacks, and females. But in relation to the GIS occupations, there is a significant minority underrepresentation in GIS occupation in the US, but also specifically in Miami-Dade County. Besides, we want to insist the fact that Miami is severely impacted by environmental threats, and the ones who suffer the most are the population of low income. In relation to the second objective that we have included in this program is the project research platform for natural disaster risk reduction. And it includes the following phases. First of all, the remote sensing, the data capture that we do with drone flights. Second, once we capture the data, we proceed to this data processing to develop the urban models. And once we complete the urban models, we follow doing the hazards, exposure, and vulnerability analysis. The next step is the risk analysis, and finally, the estimation of economic and social losses. In order to develop and test these methodologies that we are using, the first thing that we did was to choose a study region in Miami-Dade. And we have chosen this region that I'm showing here, which corresponds to this census tract that we normally call census tract 21. The following step is to plan the drone flights and to execute those drone flights. Here you can see some of the activities that we plan when we do this. First of all, the launch and the recovery positions, and then the way we plan each flight, which is a very delicate process and very precise, that is well programmed, and that could be repeated anytime we want to. Once we capture all the data, we proceed with the data processing, and we build this kind of models, 3D models, that here we can show you that we have been working with more than 1.5 billion points, densified points, in order to obtain detailed models like this. And they also allow us to build a very complete representation of the buildings that allows a visual inspection for each one of these buildings. We have also developed the data that allowed us to complete the model, the 3D digital model for the SeaWorld. Once we do this, we follow the next step is the completion, to complete the exposure model, and then to proceed to do the vulnerability and the risk analysis. This diagram shows you the tasks that are developed for this kind of analysis, and this is the tasks that are included in FEMA HASUS, which is a set of softwares that have been developed by FEMA that allow us to do the analysis of environmental impact generated by hurricanes, flooding, but also tsunamis and earthquakes. In this case, we will only be presenting the hurricane and the floods. Then, so when we talk about hazards, in this case, we will, as I mentioned, hurricanes and flooding. And this kind of analysis can follow deterministic or probabilistic approaches. And in this case, we will be showing, in this example, we will be showing the results that we obtained for a hurricane with a 500-year return period and a flooding for 100-year return periods of flooding. The FEMA HASUS models, they follow 3 levels of analysis. First, the first level is the simplest one, is based on public inventory, is a public inventory of available data. Then the second one needs an important improvement of this data, and this is what we carry out ourselves by doing the drone flights, the data capture, and the improvement of a lot of information that we will be showing to you, some of these aspects. And there is a third level that corresponds to a building-to-building evaluation that we are also doing, but we're not including this in this presentation. When we talk about exposure and we talk about the improvement of the data, we do these kind of things. These are the data that we have to obtain and then improve. It includes the location, the land use, the occupancy type, the population. There is general data and specific data. Sometimes we work only with the public data, and then we try to improve it so we can improve our models. Why do we need to improve the models? Well, here I'm showing you one example. The public data of the building footprints shows in the city of Miami, the GIS data of the city of Miami shows that the building footprints are lines like this. And when we fly the drones, we finally figure out that they correspond to nothing. There is nothing here. So there is big differences, especially in the building footprint, but in other data also. There are important differences between the public data and the data that we have obtained during especially the drone flights. One example of this is, again, this is the inventory of the exposed buildings in the census tract that we are analyzing. If you follow the public inventory that FEMA uses for its analysis, they consider that all the buildings that are included in the census tract, they add a value of $661 million. But once we have developed the analysis and the data capture that we have carried out ourselves, we have found out that this is a more realistic value. As you can see, it's 2.6 times the value that you can obtain from the public inventory. In relation to the vulnerability, the process that is followed by the FEMA hazards analysis can be, it's a probabilistic analysis that is based on certain intensity of events. And then once you have an event, you have the probability of having complete, extensive, moderate, or slight damage in the buildings. All the information that has been used to develop these models is based on actual events and also in laboratory tests that are carried out with the structures. We performed the analysis of the census tract and the buildings subjected to the 500-year return period hurricane winds, and we obtained significantly different results, as you can see here. In orange, you have the level 1 analysis with the public information, with the public data, and in blue, you will get the level 2 analysis with the improved data that we have generated. And the results lead to a number that shows that the model 2 gives losses that are 2.5 times the losses that we can obtain with the level 1. When we go to other return periods, we obtain the same difference in between the two models. Then we perform the flood analysis. The flooding will analyze the effects of the flooding for a 100-year return period flood. Here you can see the impact on the building damage, the census tract, here to the left, model 1, level 1, and to the right, level 2. And there is lots more damage in the model 2. And once you quantify these results, you obtain that the public inventory leads to a result that is 1.8 times less than the one that you can obtain with the model 2, with improved inventory. In relation to the displaced population, the results that we can obtain are both based on the data of the population given by the census of 2010, which needs to be improved. So these results are not too precise. Once we get the census tract, the census for 2020, we might be able to improve these results. In relation to the debris generated by the hurricane and by the flooding, when we talk about the hurricane, the differences is 1.9 times the debris estimated with the model 1, and in the flooding, it's 1.8 times. Well, now we come to the last goal, which is the contribution of this project to the development of a culture of resilience in Miami-Dade County. And how this project and this effort contributes to the Resilient 305 strategy that is led by the Office of Resilience of Miami-Dade County. GSEC contributes in several outcomes. One of them is the improvement of natural disaster preparedness, also the increment of understanding of resilience. And with the knowledge that the GSEC shares with the community, GSEC has a potential to contribute to expedite the disaster recovery, improvement of housing quality, reduction of sea level rise and coastal flooding impacts, and reduction of the impact of the stormwater flooding. We should develop more details about all this, but we don't have much time. Some information is presented in the article, in the paper. So the conclusions of this effort for this the first year work of GSEC. First of all, an academic pathway that supports community development has been created. Also, we have found out clearly that accurate risk analysis requires accurate data. and the available data of public sources is not always accurate. By improving the data of a target zone, we obtain results of losses and risk of around twice the resulting rated by the models that use the public data. Well, that's all, and thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Renato Molina. I'm an assistant professor at the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, as well as in the Miami Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. Today, I'm going to tell you a story of why natural disasters are a disaster in common property regimes, and in particular, we're going to examine the case of the Chilean tsunami. So we know that natural disasters inflict a disproportionate toll in developing countries and have been shown to affect both growth and welfare. But despite knowing who tends to be the most affected, little is known about the mechanisms underlying these outcomes. In this paper, I'm going to propose and provide empirical support for an important and globally relevant channel: poor economic institutions governing natural resources, and in particular, that incomplete property rights provide incentives that exacerbate immediate losses and increase the cost of recovery after natural disasters. By examining capital investments and harvest decisions for a renewable resource, I find that commonly held resources have more capital exposed to destruction and also follow more costly recovery paths. These results are particularly relevant for Caribbean nations, which are not only susceptible to a pervasive lack of well-defined and strong institutions, but also disproportionately exposed to extreme weather events. Resources under common property rights, or CPRs, are prone to competitive incentives that can lead to overexploitation and overcapitalization. These outcomes are economically inefficient because the potential rents of the resource dissipate and total output eventually decreases. But despite a body of literature documenting these problems, CPRs remain intact in developing economies and often in their poorest sectors. This pervasiveness can be attributed to the lack of managing institutions and high transaction costs that complicate the establishment of strong and well-defined property rights. The fisheries sectors are perhaps the best example of this phenomenon. The World Bank estimates that fisheries employed about 60 million people and constitute a significant source of nutrition and GDP, but still remain widely managed under common property. Surface groundwater resources have similar characteristics, where the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that water resources sustaining more than 500 million agricultural operations in developing countries remain under open access and poorly defined property rights. A similar case is found in forestry, where the World Bank suggests that around 10% of the worldwide rural population maintain small-scale forestry activities in informal common settings. These examples highlight the ubiquity of CPRs in sectors that are immediately and directly affected by natural disasters and prompt the question of how they are vulnerable to disaster risk. And to answer that question, set yourself as a CPR. In a CPR setting, the lack of poor definition of property rights over a resource would lead agents to invest and extract resources competitively and beyond the socially desirable level. This process results in capital being placed at risk of natural disasters that may annihilate it afterwards. The more agents involved in these activities, the more capital that is accumulated and exposed to destruction. The problem is further exacerbated following the disaster when every user faces incentive to rebuild damaged capital inefficiently. In the aggregate, this investment pulse increases with the competitive nature of the institutional regime, and as a result, the destruction of disaster grows larger. In addition, because natural disasters are aggregate shocks to one economy, the rush to rebuild capital in the common regime may further increase competition for emergency funds, causing rebuilding costs to rise throughout the entire economy. So how can we quantify this relationship? Can we show that it exists? In this paper, I'm going to focus on the effects of natural disasters on the capital stock used to extract a renewable resource and how capital exposure to natural disasters relates to proper right regimes. Empirical measurement of these effects requires a case in which different institutional regimes govern extraction of the same resource, the occurrence of an anticipated natural disasters, and also the ability to observe investment decisions before and after the shock. And I'm going to approximate this ideal experimental setting using small-scale fisheries in Chile, which have multiple institutional regimes that govern fishing activities. In 1991, the country introduced the possibility of granting exclusive spatial rights to small-scale fishers acting collectively through organizations. These institutions allowed fishers to take resources out of the common realm and collectively privatize them by reducing the number of firms of users operating in a given geographical area. Under this regulation, the sector now extracts the same targeted species under two property right regimes. Both sectors, however, employ capital in the form of boats and fishing gear in order to extract these fishery resources. This capital was largely destroyed by a devastating tsunami triggered by an earthquake in central Chile. By examining data on capital investment decisions and output before and after that tsunami, I'm able to observe the differences across these institutional regimes. So here's a picture of a small fishing port, and this picture illustrates the impact of the tsunami and how it affected these boats that they use to fish. So once I have this experiment set up, I have to recognize that there are a few challenges associated with this endeavor. First, organizations target multiple species across different property right regimes. Second, organizations self-select into applying for exclusive access. Third, no official or credible measurement of the stock of capital exists. Only the inflow of capital can be observed. And fourth, no detailed account of the damages caused by the tsunami exists for any organization across the country. So the main pressing challenge obviously is going to be a lack of information. So I'm going to have to get somewhat creative in order to solve these problems. And my strategy is going to be as follows. I'm going to use the production patterns of each organization in order to differentiate between those who extract the most on the common regime and those who extract mostly on the spatial proper right regime. Using the panel nature of the data, I am also able to control for individual characteristics of organizations that led them to self-select into the different regimes in the first place. In addition, I'm going to trace the height of the wave of the tsunami to construct a proxy for the damage with variation across different organizations throughout the coast. Using this national experiment, then, I'm going to measure differences in responses as a function of the property right regime, as well as the height of the tsunami wave. So my main results are going to be that before the tsunami takes place, I observed that organizations in the common regime invest on average 37% more into physical capital than organizations operating in the exclusive access regime. These differences are primarily a consequence of common property fishers investing in competitive advantage in harvesting, such as loading capacity and engine power. Moreover, after the tsunami, the differential across these regimes grows even larger. cope with unfavorable supply and market conditions after the tsunami, these results imply that every meter of tsunami was significantly more expensive for organizations in the common property regime. But that's not the entire story. This excessive investment was also partially funded by taxpayer recovery programs and philanthropy. So what are the implications of these results that I observed? Well, keeping in mind that because the common property regime incentivizes individuals to overinvest, which then leads them to overexploit. So not only we have more capital exposed, they're also poor in order to support any recovery efforts. These results provide a very dire picture for CPRs. First, resources exploited by an increasing number of firms are progressively worse off because they have more capital exposed to potential shocks, and because competitive incentives encourage inefficiently aggressive investment after the disaster. That's all associated to the proper right regime. Second, the rush to rebuild capital following the disaster inefficiently increases the price of capital, which in turn increases pressure on relief efforts and effectively raises the overall cost of the disaster throughout the entire country. When we consider the prevalence of the CPRs in the developing world, the specificity of capital resource extraction, and the fact that natural disasters have been increasing in frequency and intensity, these results have global relevance and may contribute to policy implications for reducing exposure to natural disasters due to proper right regime reform, but also because they allow us to think about what are the emergency programs that take place after the disaster and how they might be fueling very perverse incentives that not only make specific individuals worse off, but they also increase the overall cost of disaster more regionally. So that's it. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Stand by for next video, please.
Hello, my name is David McMillan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, working at the Christine E. Lynn Rehabilitation Center for the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis. And today, I will be talking to you about a community research partnership to understand hurricane preparedness in South Floridians living with spinal cord injury. We begin with a roadmap. We will start off by looking at hurricane preparedness practices pertinent for people living with spinal cord injury, as well as existing resources for this population here in our region. We will then talk about the synthesis of a collective research objective that came from engagement with our community partners. We will discuss the data specific to that community research partnership, and then talk about our updated approach for the coming 2021 season. So you might wonder, what is it about South Florida and spinal cord injury? Well, there are 4 distinct reasons why this region is popular for people living with mobility impairment and spinal cord injury in particular. The first, as indicated by this elevation map, is that South Florida is flat. All of Florida is flat, as indicated by the green. Also, Florida is warm, as indicated on this heat map by the red, and often warm, while other areas indicated by blue are cold. There is no state income tax in Florida, important given that living with spinal cord injury is expensive. And finally, Miami is home to a spinal cord injury model system, which are the premier treatment and study facilities for spinal cord injury in the U.S. Given all of that, it is important to consider that this is also an area for climate disasters, specifically in the form of tropical storms. This is a spaghetti plot of all of the named storms that have occurred and made impact with Florida since I was born in 1989, and it is a busy plot. In the name of time, I will not be going through all of the items on this list, but keep in mind that living with spinal cord injury is only possible due to robust medical intervention involving both durable medical equipment and consumable medical supplies, and all of these need to be maintained during a hurricane. In a normal context, wheelchairs are literally mechanical vectors to liberty, but they're only designed to operate in the narrow constraints of a built environment. So let's watch Allie, who, keep in mind, is a Paralympic athlete, as she attempts to ascend and descend a curb. Here she goes.
No, it's not. Woo!
No one first attempt.
One wheel. Flip sideways. I run into the car. Maybe one day the HOA will put in a curb cut.
So as we can see there, even ascending and descending a small curb can be a challenge for the durable medical equipment, and the challenges during a climate emergency are going to far exceed this. And Allie also has a high level of function relative to certain people living with spinal cord injury, and so in the context of the picture you see here, what do you think of? This person is wearing a rain suit, and if this person has paralysis that affects their upper and lower extremities, imagine how difficult it was to get into that clothing and how many people were required to assist with the donning of that clothing. Also, this person is holding an umbrella, and if they were in a manual wheelchair, would they be able to hold that umbrella and push the chair? Most likely not. It should also be considered that these wheelchairs are very heavy, and so in the absence of power, or if power has to be disconnected, would you be able to help push the chair? Some of them weigh up to 400 pounds, plus the person in them. And then one last thing that should be considered in the context of hurricanes would be, where's the battery located in this device? And for the purpose of center of mass, it's at the bottom in between the two wheels, which is closest to the ground where the rising water level will be. So there are many hurricane-specific contexts in which the normally liberating technologies that allow people with spinal cord injuries to live their lives are not disaster-friendly. And so because of this, there are direct morbidity and mortality considerations for people with SCI during a hurricane. Blunt trauma and drowning are a morbidity and mortality consideration for all people, but higher risk for people who cannot use their bodies to avoid objects in potentially negative situations. And then there are some population-specific considerations, such as autonomic dysreflexia, which is a mass sympathetic reflex that causes an increase in blood pressure that can quickly lead to cerebral or pulmonary aneurysm if not immediately treated. Mean arterial pressure can rise above 200 millimeters per mercury within a number of seconds. And there's also thermoregulation conditions where hyper or hypothermia are possible due to a reduced ability to regulate body temperature due to cardiovascular and skin changes. There are also indirect morbidities and mortalities to consider in people with spinal cord injury. Infection is common in the respiratory tract already, one of the leading causes of death in this population in a non-disaster context, and urinary tract infections are also very common, largely nowadays reduced due to the use of sterile equipment that is consumable and therefore dependent on a regular supply. Bowel programs have greatly improved the quality of life of people with spinal cord injury, but if they're not adhered to, impaction of the bowel is plausible. And skin injuries, as aforementioned, are quite common and dependent on durable medical equipment. If certain of these conditions are not maintained, if these morbidities happen, they can lead to mortality, such as urethral or rectal perforation, leading to sepsis, and sepsis leading to death quickly if not treated, and or those skin wounds, if they become infected, could also lead to a similar outcome. And then if respiratory infections are not treated, then they can lead to pneumonia. All of these are considerations during a disaster response for people with spinal cord injury, and some are hurricane specific. And so due to this, our group got together and amalgamated the known resources here in South Florida for government-provided services and resources that are emergency management, and some are hurricane specific. And so we put together a packet that combined all of this information into one consumable resource that is both digital and print. And in this packet, we identified 5 main steps that people with spinal cord injury or mobility impairment as well should go through in preparing for a hurricane. And so first, they should register with the state, county, and federal services that are available to them. And note that there are services at each of these levels. After this, they should move on. They should determine what their plan is in terms of either evacuating or sheltering in place. Next, a support network should be identified and put together. And then finally, the skills required to actually manifest the first 4 steps should be practiced, because some of these are going to be very unfamiliar and require a high degree of skill. And then after this, in our resource packet, we identify local Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County specific resources, and those are available for the people. And so to develop a research strategy to answer questions about hurricane preparedness in South Florida's SCI community, we engaged in a community research partnership guided by the Integrative Knowledge Translation guiding principles that are SCI specific, released from this resource at University of British Columbia. So let's take a look at these resources.
Research partnerships have been championed as a way to close the gap between research and practice. Despite calls for there to be nothing about us without us, spinal cord injury researchers have often been accused of using a tokenistic approach to partnership. To support meaningful spinal cord injury research partnerships, a multidisciplinary group co-developed Integrated Knowledge Translation, IKT, guiding principles. The 8 principles were rigorously developed using literature reviews and consensus methods. By using the principles, you have the potential to overcome tokenism and improve the impact of spinal cord injury research. To learn more, connect with us.
And so the community research partners that we engaged with were our local spinal cord injury support groups, which are nonprofit peer support networks. And over 3 meetings, ranging from 45 minutes to over 2 hours, we identified and synthesized a collective research objective, which could be summarized to the question, what is the experience of using hurricane preparedness services? Of 58 complete survey responses, we saw that only 3 people had used special transportation services during a hurricane crisis, and only 1 had actually gone to a special needs shelter. And so that is 5 and 2% of all participants had actually attempted to utilize the transportation and sheltering resources that appear to be available to them and on paper look robust. And so we wanted to identify why it might be the case that there is underutilization. In doing so, we developed 2 areas where we had survey items addressing the questions of special transportation service utilization during hurricanes and special needs sheltering during hurricanes. These responses were all on a 0 to 100 visual analog scale, rated from 0 being a disfavorable response and 100 being a very favorable response. And so we can see here that of the 3 participants indicated by the different color circles here, that 1 person having used the special transportation services had a favorable response, and 2 had a mostly disfavorable response, and 1 person having used the special needs shelter had a disfavorable response. And so this wide variety of responses tells us, and the small sample size, of course, which means this can only be used as an anecdote, tells us that much more research is required in this area. However, the fact that only this small number of people had utilized these services is telling. Of the people who gave a quote in the fill box provided in the survey, only those with disfavorable responses provided quotes. 1 person who used the special transportation service and the 1 person who used the special needs sheltering. And I think that this is important to consider because it is known psychologically that the remembrance of a negative event has more impact than that of a positive event. And when those events are vicariously transmitted throughout the community, the experience of one could serve for the actions of the the many and would explain why so few people are actually utilizing these services. But in summary of these quotes, the person who used the special transportation services and had a disfavorable experience said that they felt like cattle when being loaded into the vehicles, and the person who had the disfavorable special needs shelter experience described a situation where they were placed on what they called army beds instead of what they were told would be called hospital beds. And then in response to this, they developed multiple 4 pressure ulcers that were approximately 6 inches in size each. And these pressure ulcers, after the hurricane had subsided, only healed due to the help of this person's spouse and not due to medical intervention that they received afterwards. As they stand now, these are only anecdotes. However, they could provide some preliminary evidence and a hint as to why there is such low utilization of what seems to be the robust listed services here. And we need to explore this topic further, both with larger sample sizes, so a breadth of data collected, but also with the depth of data collected. And so we are updating our approach for the coming 2021 season in partnership with the Abbess Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy at the Rosenstiel School. I'd like to leave you with a quote from Mr. Anson James, who is the president of the Miami-Dade Spinal Cord Injury Support Group. Thank you so much.
The big headline in Miami-Dade tonight, there is a mandatory evacuation order.
All this is storm surge.
More street signs flying across the road right now.
A new study finds in 2017, Hurricane Irma killed more than 400 seniors living in Florida nursing homes.
I'm a paraplegic, they're quadriplegic, there are some people need oxygen, some people might need a nurse, so it depends on the individuals. Some of my friends that don't drive or don't have whatever, they rely on the Miami-Dade County transportation to pick them up and go to a shelter, hoping that they find a bed or they can do their personal needs and all that stuff like that. So it gets difficult.
Hi, good morning. My name is Chris Narducci. I'm a social science analyst with HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about HUD's research agenda on hazard risk management and resilience. As the extent and costs of disasters increase throughout the United States, HUD is developing analytical tools to better understand the risk of natural hazards to HUD-assisted populations, housing markets and economies, and the general public. HUD is also working to improve the efficacy and speed of disaster recovery and risk reduction programs, most significantly through the Community Development Block Grant, Disaster Recovery and Mitigation Grant programs. To that end, the Department's Office of Policy Development and Research is working to plan, fund, and implement an array of disaster and risk-related research and analysis projects, with several major research initiatives currently underway and some potential projects expected to begin over the next year or two. Today, I will describe several featured projects that highlight this work. First, just a bit about how HUD directly funds mitigation and resilience through its CDBG DR appropriations. There are many ways that HUD is focusing on risk exposure and risk mitigation, but over the years, the primary means of direct resilience funding has been through the DR block grant. Many of you are probably familiar with NOAA's $1 billion disaster report. The statistics are pretty clear in showing $1 billion disasters have increased over the past 3 decades. And along with this, CDBG DR allocations have also been increasing over the years. HUD currently oversees more than $50 billion in active disaster recovery grants, with disaster mitigation grants as part of that. CDBG DR allocations for resilience have increased over time, beginning in 2008 with the Disaster Recovery Enhancement Fund, and more recently with the CDBG mitigation grant funds for $16 billion that were provided in 2019. Other mitigation has been funded through that program as just part of recovery dollars, buyout programs, property elevations, retrofitting of structures, and any infrastructure designed to withstand hazard impacts of the future. Over the next few years, HUD expects to fund disaster recovery and hazard mitigation, as well as other climate-related projects. As HUD's research division, the Office of Policy Development and Research is increasingly focused on supporting the department's disaster recovery and risk reduction efforts through analysis, data products, applications, and robust research initiatives that are done both internally and through external contracts and grants. Increasingly, the research is focused on climate risk and climate risk management. Congress has provided funding for research to investigate the efficacy of HUD expenditures, strategic planning and cost-effective, cost-beneficial decision-making, implementation and monitoring and evaluation. We're also focused on hazard risk exposure and analysis, and we're focused on hazard insurance and risk to asset portfolios as well. We think that there are risks to our portfolios that go beyond direct hazard impacts, so we're interested in understanding what the scope of that risk is. And as I mentioned, we expect to focus increasingly on climate risk management going forward under the current administration. So one of the first projects I'd like to talk about is the cost effectiveness of CDBG-DR, flood mitigation in vulnerable populations. This is an external project that we're working on with the University of Iowa, RAND, Louisiana State University, Arizona State University, and University of Central Florida. Some of the questions that we're focused on in this project are basically identifying the mitigation strategies that have the most bang for our buck. So guiding grantees on how to effectively use their money to reduce losses to their communities, to their assets, and with particular focus on socially and economically vulnerable groups. They're looking at the financial return of these investments and what specific strategies are helpful and how to implement them. So this has a lot of different components. They're looking specifically at Iowa's Watershed Management Initiative and Dubuque's Healthy Homes Program, Louisiana's LA Safe. All of these are funded through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And they'll also be looking at traditional mitigation funding in Louisiana that I mentioned earlier, buyouts, elevations, and retrofits. As I mentioned, there are several different components. They're going to be doing a quantitative cost-benefit analysis using probabilistic hazard modeling. So essentially using models to predict what the risk will be over time and what the impact of that risk will be over a return period, and weighing that against the cost of doing various resilience projects. In addition to that quantitative analysis, they're also going to be looking at the outcomes of these projects that may not be monetizable. So what are the impacts on communities? What are the impacts on vulnerable populations without such investment? And weighing those in the analysis. This project will also focus on evaluative framework. So developing metrics for goal setting within communities and planning for how they want to use their money and monitoring their outcomes. We don't really have a best practice for developing metrics in communities for resilience projects. So that's what part of this work will focus on. They'll also be using a literature review and demonstrating the value of an area flood vulnerability index. So coming up with vulnerability data that's a composite index that can be mapped over space. And this will be specific to flood vulnerabilities, whereas previous similar indices have looked at lots of different hazards. This will focus on flood. And one of the most important products that will result from this project is guidance for grantees. So going back through those components, guidance on how to conduct cost-benefit analysis, guidance on how to produce metrics and use them for planning and for monitoring, and also guidance on how to use the vulnerability index in their planning process. Another project that we're working on with enterprise community partners is an evaluative tool looking at the implementation and reach of CDBG-DR funded flood resilience efforts. And specifically, they're looking at what considerations and processes did communities use in selecting projects, and what best practices can we take from that to scale that in other communities throughout the country. And they're specifically focused on how implementation was done so that it reached the most vulnerable populations in a community. What guidance can facilitate grantee engagement with vulnerable communities, and how to plan better so that the allocations are equitable. And are there innovative or novel practices that we can scale across other communities. So the components of this project are a survey of best practices. They'll be conducting qualitative interviews, and like the previous project, they'll be producing guidance tools that can be used by grantees. Related to hazard risk exposure and planning, and this is not specifically focused on CDBG-DR or CDBG mitigation, but in-house we're doing a lot of work assessing the risk exposure of HUD assets, assisted populations, and the general population of the United States, with specific focus on flood and wildfire. These seem to be the most costly disasters that we actually have public data on risk. So for flood risk, obviously there are the FEMA flood maps that we could use, and we're also exploring proprietary data to assess risk beyond the regulatory flood maps provided by FEMA. For wildfire, we've been able to use United States Postal Service data on zip codes, as well as the United States Forest Service wildfire hazard potential data. And we can combine all of these data sources to estimate the impact or the potential future impact of floods and wildfires on the general population, as well as HUD assets. There's, as I mentioned, growing interest and investment in climate risk analysis and management, and we're hoping to increase our capacity to do this sort of risk exposure work. Related to this, HUD has previously announced a rule for CDBG entitlement and state grantees to use climate risk data as it plans for its allocation of CDBG funding. We call this the Con-Plan Resilience Rule. I believe it was released in 2016. So grantees are asked to consider climate hazard risk data as they conduct their planning. And one way that we thought we might be able to help them is to fund a case study of best practices that we're working on with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is another federal agency. So they'll be working with select grantees to use data on climate risks in their planning process and to sort of document those cases as best practices for incorporating hazard risk into planning. So we're hoping that this will produce guidance for grantees, and this should be something we begin working on this year and into next year. The next project that I wanted to highlight is something we focused on with the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, which guarantees mortgages throughout the country. This is one of our largest portfolios. There's approximately 8 million homes, single-family homes, that have mortgages that are secured by HUD. So it's an enormous portfolio, and homes in this program are required to take on flood insurance if they're located within FEMA's special flood hazard area, otherwise known as the 100-year floodplain. But we have a lot of questions about the extent to which homes are carrying that insurance. What is the flood risk exposure of the portfolio at large? So to do this, we contracted with 2M Research, and we also partnered with FEMA in accessing the National Flood Insurance Policy data. They have property level data on policies and the claims made against those policies throughout the country. And we focused on the states of Florida and North Carolina in conducting this analysis. So they used the data to match with the FHA portfolio, the single family portfolio. And their goal is basically to answer, the extent of the flood risk exposure, what is the rate of adherence to insurance requirements among homes in the floodplain, and is there a relationship between flood damage claims and loan delinquency or default following those claims? So this is sort of an unprecedented study because we were able to access data and match it in ways that we haven't done before. And the findings were pretty substantial. We understand that a number of FHA insured mortgages are located in flood zones. It's a pretty significant number, especially in the states we looked at, North Carolina and Florida. Half of FHA insured mortgages in higher flood risk areas don't carry the required insurance, which is less than we anticipated. The flood insurance claims also are associated, for those homes that do carry flood insurance, they're associated with a higher likelihood of subsequent mortgage default. So We know that we need to do more research and look at different regions, but the finding seems to be clear that not enough homes are carrying flood insurance, even when they're required to carry that insurance. So this poses a huge risk to HUD, and something that we're working on to improve those rates and also to get better data so that we can monitor those rates better going forward. So those are just a few of our featured research projects. We're under a new administration that is very focused on climate risk analysis and improving how disaster recovery and disaster mitigation work. So it's sort of a new world, and we know that hazards pose a risk to HUD assets and the population at large that is greater than simply the impact of natural hazards. There's risk inherent in the value of our assets and the value of homes, and we need to be very focused on analyzing and estimating what that risk is. We know that access to data and prioritization of analytics can help HUD and the public to better understand these risks and to mitigate these losses. So that's what we're focused on. And we're viewing these actions in particular through an equity lens, because that is something that HUD is very focused on, and that is something that this administration is focused on. So, we're focused on questions that look at disparate impact on populations that have been traditionally marginalized or that are under-resourced. We're also interested in, the disparity in the impacts of climate change in general and how we could reduce that disparity. So these are just some of our projects and sort of the philosophy that underlies our research agenda. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about some of these. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is listed here. And have a great rest of your session and symposium. And thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Very fascinating and somewhat diverse group of presentations there on disaster mitigation. I did have, I have a question. I'll start for the whole panel, and you guys can take turns in answering and respond to each other potentially. You guys all have research that have applications in the real world setting, but you do it from different places in the world. Some of you are academicians. Chris, you work sort of in-house with the same people that execute your research, right? But at the same time are subject to the whims of the fancies of administrations and have to turn on a dime based on whatever's flowing through politics, the winds of politics, I suppose. But if you go from Chris's position where the research is done in-house with execution done in-house of whatever you come up with, to what David was talking about in terms of the tokenism of his research and those criticisms, and Renato, your discussion about how it's been well documented that CPRs don't benefit anyone, no matter what the time is. There are many drawbacks to having them, regardless of a disaster. And Carlos, your discussion about how baseline data coming from the government seems sort of wildly inaccurate. How do you feel, all of you, about where you sit, where you work, and how well you're able to execute both getting your research done and then practically applied into a real world setting? I'll start with you, Chris, because you work in research within a real world setting. In what I would guess would be sort of the easiest way to push that through, but I could easily be wrong.
So, it's a good question, because in HUD, we have a research division that does sort of independent research. We contract it out, we do it in-house. We are separate and distinct from the office that provides the funding to do a lot of this work. I formerly worked in that office, so I have a sort of unique perspective of that. That office is very focused on administration of just enormous grant funds. They're providing this out to communities that have to very quickly work to support recovery. So research is not real. The long-term research that I'm focused on now in my research division isn't a high priority among the folks that have to work on ensuring the money goes out and is appropriately used. So, there's definitely a disconnect. And that's something that both practitioners and researchers should work more on sort of reducing that distinction and reducing that kind of disconnect. Because there's a lot of opportunities to create research that is geared towards the questions that grantees and practitioners have. I feel like sometimes we get lost as researchers in sort of this discussion of building on the literature and focusing on the literature, the questions that arise in the literature. But there's an ability to work with practitioners to understand what their questions are and how the research can answer those questions. So that's something that I'm trying to work on a lot in my role in the research division. I also want to bring up one point about, you sort of alluded to it, at HUD and the federal government, our priorities change according to what the administration wants and according to what the administration is focused on. So that's sort of a frustrating thing that we have to sort of deal with. We're really responding to what Congress gives us money for and what the White House says is a priority. Hopefully going forward, it becomes more of a consistent, concern to address the needs that are arising out of climate change and arising out of these, national and global issues. And I think we've sort of hit a breaking point over the last few years where we'll start to see that.
That's good to hear. David, you brought up this concern in your video about tokenism in research. How do you think it's going for you?
Can I follow up with the question for Chris real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Chris, it's like a new administration, so it's a new space, so things are changing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's a very different take on climate change and how to address it. That's not to say that the previous administration wasn't focused on the impacts of climate change. I think this administration is focused on adaptation to the impacts, but also focused on mitigating climate change itself through energy and carbon emissions reductions and that sort of thing. It seems like, there's more focus on both fronts as far as how research can be used to address those two problems. So that's exciting for my office.
And so within the adaptation realm, you said there's more of a focus on equity. So if let's say you're someone like me and you think that you're working with a marginalized population, it's like, how can I take advantage of the changing space?
There's a lot of opportunities, HUD funds opportunities, HUD, funds research in this realm. And then, our program office, which I mentioned earlier, that allocates the funding, is increasingly interested in developing tools to help grantees understand who those marginalized populations are. So one thing I'm kind of consulting them on is a toolkit for grantees that sort of helps them identify the areas in their jurisdiction, the geographic areas in their jurisdiction that have the most need and where resources should be allocated. Trying to connect with HUD and the grantees in your community that receive those funds. If you're located in Florida, for example, they receive the CDBG DR funds. They administer them. They're the ultimate owner of those grants, and they're the ones who need to comply with fair housing and equal opportunity, which includes protected classes, which I believe includes those who are disabled. So you could work through HUD, but you might want to also consider working through your state and local jurisdiction that are administering those CDBG DR and CDBG mitigation grants.
That's great. Thank you. If you make the toolkits, I'll use them.
They're working on it. They should be released in the next year.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so Elizabeth, to address your question, I think engaging community partners in every step of the research process is one way to avoid this. tokenism concern. It also just makes research better in every way, shape, or form. So with the bigger question, I think was related to the topic of how I feel it's going in terms of making a real world impact. In terms of how deep my pockets are, I've had a PhD for like 5 months. I'm a postdoctoral fellow. Don't have a lot of influence up the chain. I'm at the bottom of the masthead, but I have skin in the game, and I have a different approach to research than a lot of people who came before me. So by engaging these community partners, and then also creating like specific dissemination and engagement strategies for them, like we made multiple podcast episodes about the results of this survey, and we're engaging them to update our approach for the 2021 season. So I think these things can make a difference on an individual level. How that trickles up to policy, and hopefully I learn how to do that throughout my career. So.
Well, you're in the right place. I think, even though research is changing, you're at a very influential organization. And, I think in terms of spinal cord injury, it's almost hard to remember what it was like 10 years ago and 20 years ago. But if you go certainly to a developing country and try to imagine yourself in a wheelchair there, you think about all the progress here. Certainly a lot to be done. And the issue of the shelters and disaster mitigation, I think, is at the forefront of everybody's mind in the disability world as these things become more frequent. Any thoughts, Renato and Carlos?
Yeah. So, first of all, I just realized how annoying my voice is when recorded and reading from a script. So I apologize for that. A very interesting work that you guys are doing. I come from a different perspective, which is basically understanding how institutions shape the way in which disasters, or like any shock, it could be climate change or specific disasters such as the one I just analyzed, affect how people basically are set up to face those disasters and how they recover. And from my perspective, I think one of the challenges here is trying to implement institutional changes without creating any losers. And that is challenging because, so for instance, if you think from the status quo perspective, right, like, and this is not only true for Chile, it's also true, for instance, when a hurricane hit several islands and I think that was Maria, hit several islands in the Caribbean, and then the U.S. government started to implement this program with subsidies and rebuilding boats, basically, by giving free money, kind of like fueling a problem that was already there. There were too many boats fishing too few fish, right? So then the disaster comes. All of these fishermen might be impoverished because of the poor institutions that they work under, and then basically the government keeps fueling that inefficiency. And from a politics perspective, it's very, very unpopular to go and propose, what, from now on you cannot fish anymore, and that's a challenging part, all right? And while I would like for an alternative to exist where everyone is made better off following institutional change, such as developing proper rights for the extraction of natural resources, or provide the right housing development incentives, so we don't have impoverished housing and susceptible and low income housing be more exposed to hurricanes, for instance. We have to think very carefully about how to develop these policies and be also honest with decision makers and stakeholders, in the sense that not all policies are win-win scenarios, and we have to be very clear in terms of sometimes people are going to lose, but they're going to lose less if they remain exposed to certain shocks or certain disasters. And I think that's a big challenge, and the way in which I think we as researchers can have a big impact in the world is kind of developing that vocabulary that allows to communicate research findings to a policymaker in a way that these trade-offs are clear, right? That we need to be able to understand, listen, there are needs, people are going to suffer. We need to come up with devices that allow the overall suffering to be decreased. And maybe some people will avoid complete suffering, but some ones are going to be suffering less. And that's tricky, that's tricky. And I think from a researcher perspective, that's usually, I don't know, at least from a PhD perspective, that's usually ignored, right? And that's where I think the new generation of researchers and policymakers are basically making strides that are establishing a clear channel of conversation between them. And I would like to think I'm part of that conversation. So I think we're doing the right things. It's just, it requires a lot of effort and also being clear about what are the trade-offs when it comes to different policies.
Yeah, I think your project highlights like a very prominent theme in disaster research, generally speaking, in that people, when you're trying to make institutional change, like what you're talking about, it's better to do it in the period where there's not a disaster, right? Where there isn't a catastrophe ongoing. And then at the same time, getting traction on a project that has to do with disaster mitigation outside of everyone's interest in it, focused on an actual disaster, is very difficult. So, making these long-lasting changes, I think, is a frustration for everybody in the field. And I think what you were talking about really highlights how frustrating that can be. It's impossible to get traction on it outside of the problem, but then it's impossible to get traction on it inside of the problem too.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that will be true not only for fishermen, it will be true for like every population that gets hit by a shock. And it's a challenging process. And I think the more knowledge that we were able to disperse to the overall public and stakeholders, the easier it is to actually make sense of institutional changes.
I think I wanted to say that's a really good point in understanding the distinctions between sort of blue sky planning and thinking about these things and planning and mitigation in the midst of a disaster. And it's perfectly exemplified by how HUD does disaster recovery and disaster mitigation. We only give money out to communities after a disaster when it's declared by the president. And then it goes through this allocation process, and then communities get this huge amount of funding to do recovery and mitigation. And yet the best time to really stop and consider this before people are impacted, before economies, homes, lives are lost, is before the disaster. And we don't even give money out in the midst of, blue skies. So one thing that we're trying to focus more on is creating frameworks for communities to do this sort of planning and thinking before there's a disaster. And I mentioned in the presentation that we have a new resilience rule for communities that receive just the regular CDBG funding, which is not during a disaster. They're required to consider climate projections when they're doing their planning and when they're submitting their action plan for funding. And in addition to that, I talked also about sort of the risk analytics that I'm trying, plenty of us are trying to build up, getting risk data and making that available to communities as they're doing planning and, separate from when they're recovering from a disaster.
I would like to add a couple of things. Trying to answer your question, Chris, Liz, how do you feel? We feel that the message is very hard to pass. It's hard to pass because especially people feel that is interesting just when the things happen and not while they're planning to prepare themselves for things not to happen. The notion of risk itself is very confusing in general. And I am very happy to hear some of the presentation that we had today, especially Chris's, because Chris insists in the way that the risk has to be quantified to be well understood. And normally people are not clear when they're talking about vulnerability, when they're talking about exposure, and when they're talking about risk. You will see several methods that are presented as vulnerability methods that can be used to assess the results. And that is wrong. That is not clear enough. We need to quantify the effects of risks. And how do we quantify them? By economic losses, but by people who suffer, by victims. And this is the main issue that we have to pass, the message that we have to try to pass. In my case, I work in Miami-Dade College, which is it's the largest two-year college in the US. We have more than 100,000 students. And I can tell you that it's been very hard to create a program to try to discuss these kind of things.
Even though we're working in this college, we're doing very high level research because we are gathering with other universities and we have very good experts. We're developing with us the tools to work with. But in the population that we have to target when we do this program, first of all, is the students, including high school students, where we're trying to get involved into the reality of their own lives, in the threats that they suffer where they live. And they live in some of them, most of them in poor areas, and they cannot foresee what can happen to their own lives. Then we have to convince the college authorities that this has to be done, and then work with the communities based on the relationship with the students for them to pass the message. And after that, we have to deal with the local governments who just have too many interests. And sometimes the decisions by the local governments are controlled by the developers. I've been talking to majors in several areas and municipalities here. And when I tell them, listen, you have to develop your own tool. And this tool has to be at the beginning confidential, because you're going to have crazy results. You're going to see that the risk is lots higher than you think. Even it's higher than the FEMA results deliver. So this is something that you really have to handle politically, but you really have to know the reality. And when they know that the risks are going to raise, they're going to say, no, I don't want to have this. I don't want to have this information because the cost of the housing, people are going to flee, are going to leave. And the developers do not want to hear about this. So at the end, I think we're aligned in a process in which we have to insist that the risk has to be part of the understanding of our own lives. Just like when we do the investments in the stock market, you see, we understand there is something called risk, and you have to take considerations about that. This is something that we have to do with what we're dealing with.
Spoken like a true academic that has to deal with the government at the same time. The frustration, I mean, actually I hadn't really, after listening to your presentation, I hadn't really thought about that sort of level of frustration, like the cultural level of frustration. But I mean, just the sort of bad data alone is pretty impressive. And I'm guessing that that's in part because Miami is a very ever-changing city. I mean, you're looking at the drone video, and a house that was there a minute ago is now 10 times bigger and 2 lots, and it's a totally different world every cycle. So, and I mean, if you could, all right, that's a local concern, but I'm sure it's going in coastal communities and disaster susceptible communities in other places for sure, not just our changing landscape.
Liz, you said it, it's a local problem. The FEMA develops the global national methodologies, and then you have to put more accurate data, but that's a local task. You have to develop it locally, because you cannot be flying drones all over the US. That would take, because the satellites are not precise enough. And some of the images that you get are not good enough. And if you work with Google, Google is not able to go into all the other places that you need to gather information from. So at the end, you also have to develop local capacities and work with the local governments and communities. And that's why I think the local colleges are great for this and a great opportunity to deliver this. But the work is hard to deliver because we need resources. But Chris, I'm gonna be bothering you because I need your help. And I'm sure that I will be helpful for you too.
It's, that problem comes up in virtually every research project. Like the best data is local, but we can't have, we often don't have national data that is as precise and detailed. And it's it's always a, sort of a cost benefit analysis we do when we're thinking about how to do research. Do we want to get the entire, we want to increase the geographic scope of the study and get okay data? Or do we want to, sort of home in on specific communities and get like much better data? And then the more deep down you dig, the more expensive the research is, which, is a legitimate concern. If it's cost prohibitive, then, people can't do the research. But I fully agree, especially with the FEMA flood data, it's a good sort of national picture, but it's far better to have more detailed data at a more, state or regional or local level that allows people to do sort of the best planning and the best decision making.
Yeah, that goes down to David's issue, I think, which is a very hyper local issue, you know, with a very select subset of the population. And I hadn't realized myself that we kind of, not only do we have sort of incidentally people here with spinal cord injury, but we probably have above the averages because we attract people to live down here for very specific reasons. And David, are the shelters that the one guy was complaining about, is that a spinal cord injury specifically kitted out shelter, or is it just special needs of all stripes?
So those shelters are not specific to any pathology, general special needs shelters. I want to say that there are 4,000 people in Miami-Dade, más o menos, registered for the special needs shelters. And this could be everyone from someone with a mobility impairment because they're very old to someone young with a spinal cord injury. I'm actually receiving my CERT, FEMA Community Emergency Response Training, starting this weekend. So I will hopefully start to learn a little bit more about how these shelters work. But from what I've heard, if you have general mobility impairment needs, the shelters accommodate you. But if there's something specific about your condition, you're not going to find specific help there. And so what most people are doing is kind of shouldering the burden themselves. So the burden is shifted onto the community because of the, if you will, reputation of the resources. Because when you look online, the resources are there, but when you look in practice, they're not being used. And there has to be a reason. That's what we want to use this research project to address. We don't have the answer yet. But yeah, so.
Do these online communities of patients with spinal cord injury, do they tend to coalesce in geographic areas that are similar, or buildings, or do they have a certain demographic or like financial group that they all kind of fall into, or is it very, very disparate?
Oh, sorry. When I say online, I mean the listed government provided resources.
No, but I was talking about the support group from which you drew your community partnership.
Mm-hmm. Very regional. They're all, or most, I should say, are nonprofits. Mm-hmm. And so in each one, there's a Miami-Dade, a Broward, and a Palm Beach. They're all technically, you know, their own separate organizations. And they try to serve local. Pre-COVID, it was all about events and meetups, getting people out of their homes, getting them into the community. So. If we're here with like a little bit of lull, Renato, yeah. I have a question.
Please do.
Cool. So thank you. I love how you say that as, you know, academics, we should be both institutionalists, but also providing like a lexicon for people. So you kind of set up the situation where there's weak institutions. This results in overcapitalization. So then in response to disasters, there's this like perverse incentive to extract capital from the commons. So if we want to defend the commons in that sense, then we should strengthen institutions. Does that sound right? And if that's the case, I just want to ask, like, which institutions do you think would be the ones to do so? Carlos might have hinted at it.
Yeah. So for instance, I mean, like, two examples that I can come up with right now. But remember that this is just a case when you have natural resources that are being extracted, right? Like you could think about fisheries, and you could also think about fresh water or groundwater, right? Proper institutions that we know work are clear and well-defined proper rights, meaning it's not open for everyone. So for instance, if you go to a developing country, usually fisheries are there and whomever has a boat can go and fish them. But the problem is like everyone has the same incentive, and that's when we have the problem that is known as open access. So when we talked about clear institutions for the extraction of these resources, what I'm referring to is clear and well-defined proper rights that delineate who has access, how much access they have to a given resource. So they have an incentive to maintain that resource in the most, you know, like healthy level possible, because they know it will be there tomorrow, right? If you don't know if the fish that you're leaving in the water is going to be there tomorrow for you to fish the next year, then there is no incentive for you to leave it in the water. and it's the same when you think about groundwater, when you're competing in order to pump the water from a reservoir because your neighbor might extract it as well. And this is a problem that people face in areas such as California, right? Where like basically everyone it's trying to pump water before your neighbor pumps it first, right? Because it will become it could become scarce, but it also makes it more expensive for you to pump when you have more competitors. So those are very clear reasons. The problem, however, is that once you start delineating those institutions, there are going to be losers. And that's a problem that is usually very hard to face when it comes to any of these changes, that you have to be clear that the people are going to miss out. And that might, might mean leaving some fishermen without a job, or some, like farmers without access to water.
So I mean, I'm just getting like this theme of like generally like anti-rivalrous approach. And as an economist, like, you're like applying game theoretics to this? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
All right. So I think we're just about at the right time to wrap it up. Any final thoughts?
Just thank you to everyone. I enjoyed listening to all of your research and the work that you're doing, and I'm inspired and excited by it, frankly. So thanks.
Yeah, likewise. It was really interesting to learn about all of these different approaches, and particularly the work that David is working on. I mean, like, obviously, I don't face those challenges, and sometimes you just forget about them, and it's pretty interesting and illuminating to see like how these people actually have to suffer, and how we should actually take action to make their lives like more, I don't know, more decent.
And we will.
Thank you for the meeting. It's sad that we cannot go together to have a lunch.
I'm starting to miss like bad coffees and boxed salads at conferences. You know what that's a sad state, but hopefully sooner rather than later next time. But thank you guys for all of your passion and excellent work and commitment, especially to this city, and fingers crossed for this hurricane season.